Bush Memorial Center at Russell Sage College. I've wanted to go inside this building for quite some time. It's been locked when I've tried. But there's a meeting being held tonight about another development I've been following, the Congress Ferry Street Bridge. So let's see what's going on.
Oh, good. I can still talk to you. Yeah. Without risk.
That's sticking out.
Morning. I just kind of like saying it. I don't know, it has a nice feel to it. Alright, so there was a record article that came out yesterday, about the meeting that was held at the Russell Sage College Bush Memorial Center. I have not read it yet. This is still not the right one. Come on now. The meeting itself I thought was very brief. There wasn't much substance to it other than the proposal of a couple options that the development company is sort of tossing around in connection with another big project that's actually happening right in that same area that's a separate but also connected through the streets that are being impacted in both projects. So here's the article. Super exciting. So this is actually a pretty main, quote-unquote, artery of the downtown district of Troy. So here's Troy. So here's the Congress Street Bridge right here, and this is Ferry Street, one way toward the east, traveling eastward. And then here's Congress Street up here, westbound. And it kind of takes this, well, Congress Street technically goes all the way down to Front Street, but it goes right by Russell Sage. So this is actually right here is where the meeting was held. And the other project that they have going on right now that this is impacting is actually the building right here that looks like a T, and over here as well. So this plot and this plot stretching either sides of Ferry Street There's also construction going on right here. A big affordable housing. It might also be intended for retirement age. A big building here is currently being developed. So there's a lot of development going on in this particular corridor region. There's a lot of, so this is a ramp right here too. This River Street going onto the bridge is a ramp. So this is street level here, and then as you turn onto River Street and go up to the bridge, it's ascended in level. And then here, this descends down this section here, going down towards Division Street. And then right here along Ferry is a tunnel. So you actually kind of like, you come over the bridge and you dip down into a tunnel. Yeah. Okay, so you can kind of see the tunnel here. This is where some landscaping ends. And same right here, there's some landscaping that just comes to this abrupt end. And there's a Ferry Street. So Ferry Street goes under this bridge right here and out the side. So they made 3 proposals on reconfiguring this traffic flow, inclusive of bike transportation. Nothing was really speaking to me at the time I was listening to this, other than it was mentioned how the project that the Congress Street, Ferry Street project is communicating and sort of collaborating with this other project here, the Taylor Apartments project, coordinating with them because the street infrastructure impacts the development that's going on with these Taylor apartment developments. And so I sort of was wondering how that communication, how that collaboration is informing itself. And I suppose, and what I mean by that is specifically if there is delay or if there even is acceleration in one project, how does that then impact the other project in terms of its development when the projects are attempting to sort of collaborate in their development projects together, or at least be in communication with one another in terms of the progress of their developments. And so that sort of tug and pull, if you will, I'm curious how that will unfold. Because the Ferry Congress Street Bridge, possibly even the Taylor Apartments development, both developments, I believe, have been intended for quite some time. Not 100% sure of that, but there you go. Project that's been in the works for years. Yeah, I remember, I found this quite interesting as well, that the funding for this project is 80% federally funded and 20% funded by the city. I didn't know if that was because it's DOT related, like there's some kind of Department of Transportation jurisdiction here. I wasn't quite sure why, but I found that split to be quite severe. The federal funding is all reimbursement. It's funny because Annie, when the meeting ended and I took the video footage of just the ceiling, at first I was going to record the crowd itself, but I just found the ceiling architecture and geometry and painted glass and artwork just so beautiful that I figured I'll just record this beautiful picture, if you will, and record the sounds. And as I was sitting there recording, after about 10 to 15 seconds, or however long the video actually is, the reason that video ended was because a woman came up to me and started commenting about how I was just, she actually asked a question. She asked me, oh, are you just, you know, the ambiance? And so we struck up a conversation, and it turned out to be Annie Borthwick. And so we sat there and talked for probably a half an hour, maybe even upwards of 45 minutes, just talking. And during our conversation, that's when Erica, who is the author of this article, she came up to us and asked if we wanted to make a comment on the meeting. And so she's here quoting Annie, and it's just funny to me because I was sitting here with them as Annie was making these comments and Erica was recording it. Annie was very, very sweet. I had never met her before. Oh, wow. I just had this like rush of, I don't even know what to call it, electricity or something, like run from my body. I felt it all the way up into here. I didn't even get there yet. I was literally on proposal 1, and I don't know, it's like when you hear your name or you read your name in something, it's like you automatically zoom in and focus onto it, like I feel almost like a flush. Okay, so proposal 1A offers, oh, good Lord, okay. Proposal 1A offers one-way buffered bike lanes to go down Ferry Street and up Congress Street with a vertically raised bike lane in the Ferry Street tunnel. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's already a one-lane tunnel. Excuse me, it's not one lane, it's one way. Okay, so there's 2 lanes in the tunnel that go one way. So in this proposal 1A, they're proposing to transform one of the car lanes into a raised bike lane. Yeah, so when you come out of Ferry Street, as it is right now, when you come out, I don't believe, if I remember correctly, I don't believe that, yeah. So you come out, and it's not an only right, and it's not like an only straight. They don't have those kind of designations. So when you're back on this bridge area, you can do it. You're going west, concrete barrier, yeah. So Congress Street right now as well. Did we go into the void? Oh, maybe we were staring at a wall? I don't know. Okay. So this is Congress Street. This is Congress Street going west. So this is going back towards the river. And there's 2 lanes with parking on one side. I don't believe there's parking really allowed on the left side, but I have noticed in my own travels that there are commercial trucks that will sometimes park here if they're making some kind of delivery to a business. And that has actually caused a little bit of traffic and a little bit of backup and having to go around the truck into this right lane. So seemingly, if I also remember correctly from the presentation, what they were proposing is that this left lane would become a bike lane. So this would, similar to how on Ferry Street, designating one of those 2 lanes as a bike lane, except that bike lane would only go one way. This proposal has Congress Street transforming one of the lanes also into a bike lane. However, the bike lane would be 2 ways. So bikes could travel both ways in one of these lanes. And I think that there's some barrier that they would put here so that, you know, cars don't transgress. But it would still keep it one lane for traffic, which, because of how I've seen truck deliveries park on the street, I'm not really quite sure how that would affect traffic if this was just a 1 lane road. Yeah, so Ferry Street would have parking on both sides. I don't remember if in this proposal, the parking that's currently there, if that would remain on Congress so that there's only parking on one side and Ferry Street would have 2 parking on both sides. Or if they would remove parking entirely from Congress Street, I don't remember. But puts parking on both sides of both streets and moves all bike traffic to a 2-way lane on Liberty Street. It is the cheapest, but would remove one side of parking on Liberty Street where the Morning Star Montessori School sits. Liberty Street is down here. So they're proposing that in the 3rd proposal, they would construct Ferry Street and Congress would be 1 lane each. Correct? Makes both streets 1 lane, puts parking on both sides of both streets. Okay, so both Ferry and Congress would be 1 lane to drive, and then both sides of both streets would have parking. And then the bike path, the bike traffic, if you will, would officially be moved down off Ferry Street and Congress Street to Liberty Street. Now, I remember someone commenting after the meeting that bike riders are going to go where they're going to go. Not all of them necessarily follow the official bike path, but this proposal is officializing it down to Liberty Street. Now, Liberty Street, as far as I recall, is narrower. Yeah. It's interesting. The ramp, when you come off of the Congress Street Bridge, so here's the bridge, and then you come off the bridge and down the ramp, not decentralize, descend, thank you. When you descend down the bridge, you pass a little intersection here, and then you get to Liberty Street. I believe this parking lot is for Russell Sage College. Yeah, so you come down, and then theoretically this street here would become this officialized bike path. And it's definitely narrower. So a 2-way lane for bike traffic on Liberty Street would remove one side of parking where the Morning Star School sits. Okay, so you come down here. The Morning Star School is up here. So you see that, I mean, cars park on both sides. So theoretically, somehow, this street would be transformed into a 2-lane bicycle traffic pathway. It remains a one-way road for cars, but I suppose in some sections maybe. So the school is right here. This is the school. It's hard to see that, but this is the school. So they're saying that, oops, they're saying that potentially remove one side of parking where the school sits, which is interesting because I've noticed often people congregating in this area with their children. I don't know what that's going to mean for parents or whoever is picking up kids or dropping kids off at this school, how that's gonna impact that. But that's kind of interesting. And then you just continue down Liberty Street. What's also interesting is just a total side note. These buildings right here, these like colonial looking buildings, I believe they were built in like the 1830s, if I'm remembering correctly. I noticed that this one here, just recently this past week, had these columns removed because, let's see, because this one, this really insecurely structured column. It's actually been like that for quite some time, but I think largely because of that, all four of them have been removed, and this porch has been removed. So you can actually see the brick on the bottom of the building, which is pretty cool because, I mean, it's been over, man, my math, almost somewhere, give or take a couple years here and there, like 180 years. That's incredible. Maybe I'll see if I can go and take a picture of it. I don't know if they've done any work on it since, but it's so cool. Oh, they covered the brick. The brick was totally exposed. Its natural color. And one of these, so I remember reading about Troy when I first moved here in one of those like historic little books, and 3 of these colonial buildings are quote unquote original, and one of them was built as sort of a, what's the phrase, a copy. Okay. So in today's record, it appears that we have an article about the Planning Commission being repealed and replaced with a planning board. Another follow-up article to perhaps a follow-up meeting. So this city council meeting that is being referred to, this special finance meeting, was this past Thursday, the 1st. I did not watch it live. I watched it last night. It was actually a rather quick meeting in juxtaposition with the hours-long meetings that preceded it on this particular topic. What I found the most interesting was this aspect about conflict of interest. There was a question brought up by Councilmember McLaren regarding conflict of interest because apparently, now I haven't read it and I haven't read further in this article, but apparently, if I'm remembering correctly, as part of the revisions to the planning board code, there could be city employees appointed to the board, and or as alternates. And so Councilmember McLaren brought up whether and inquired into whether this was inherently, and I believe she actually used the word inherent, whether there is inherent conflict of interest there. And it seemed as though there were two city attorneys present. I don't know if there's more than 2 city attorneys on staff, but one of them was the more recent hire at the sort of beginning of 2024. I'm blanking on her name. She seems to be more involved in drafting city legislation and city ordinance language and contractual language with certain city partnerships. The other attorney, who I'm also blanking on his name, but he, from what I've observed, he seems to be a little bit more involved with how the city is operating, the operations of the city in its staff, in its sort of internal operations. And both of these attorneys were present at the meeting, this finance meeting. And it was, both of them spoke towards this conflict of interest, but it was predominantly the gentleman who addressed it. And I feel relatively confident in saying that he felt as though there was not a conflict of interest unless there was some kind of personal benefit that would have accrued to the city employee who theoretically would be in that position. But when I was listening to it, it really, really piqued my curiosity. Whether there is this inherent conflict of interest of a city employee being appointed to a city board, a sort of arm of the city that approves and disapproves. Speirn McLaren. I knew there was another aspect to her name. I have a harder time remembering that than McLaren. Speirn McLaren. I kind of want to really quickly... Actually, this is kind of interesting because this was also brought up as a total side note. Now that I'm looking at the code again, this there was a public member commenting in this finance meeting about the Troy flag. He felt really prideful about Troy and was recommending to the city council that the Troy flag be sort of reinvented, if you will, really marketed so that the people of Troy could unite around this symbol. Yeah, so it's like the design of it is already sort of in the charter, encoded. No city ordinance shall be adopted at the same meeting at which it is introduced, or until 7 days have elapsed. You can't have it be the same meeting, which is what I found to be the most ambiguous. Or, not and. Yeah, actually, now the or is actually kind of confusing to me. It doesn't have to be both, which I guess it wouldn't make sense anyway. If it's the same meeting, it's not going to be 7 days elapsing. 7 days aren't elapsing when it's the same meeting, theoretically. So I didn't really focus too much on that in the previous exploration into that code language, except I believe I briefly commented that it certainly wasn't 2/3 passed. Though it is debatable on whether the council got the legislation 7 days before the vote. Thursday's meeting will make it 7 days before it's acted on next week. I feel like they're really confusing it. Or it's like the more it's talked about, the more it's confusing. Right, so introduction goes back to what I also looked at last time. Here we go. Okay. The term introduce legislation shall, I know I feel like I'm kind of like going back over what I talked about in the last video. The term introduce legislation shall mean the date on which proposed legislation is placed on the agenda of the City Council Finance Committee. So again, it goes back to the placing on the agenda. That's also ambiguous. Placed on the agenda. The other thing that's confusing is to go back to this language. I know I'm sort of going over this again, but this here in the definitions of local laws, ordinances, and resolutions, the language is slightly different than it is in the previous language of the legislative jurisdiction, where here it says no ordinance shall be passed. Is passing an ordinance distinct from adopting an ordinance? No ordinance shall be passed by the council on the same day. And again, this is different than the language that says the same meeting. No ordinance shall be passed by the city council on the same day on which it is introduced, being when it is placed on the agenda, except by a 2/3 vote of all members of the council, which didn't happen. There was not a 2/3 vote of all members. So it seems like in this language, almost regardless of the ambiguities, what is not ambiguous is that there was not a 2/3 vote of all members of the council. But then again, this 2/3 specifically is only referencing when an ordinance is passed on the same day. So if it is being argued that the ordinance is not passed on the same day it is introduced, then this particular language here is theoretically irrelevant. And the language that was in the previous section is relevant, where it's not even talking about necessarily the same day, but it's referencing a same meeting. It's referencing just an ordinance being introduced. And still, the introducing legislation is referring to when that proposed legislation was placed on the agenda. 7 days have elapsed since it was placed on the agenda. Which in here, though it is debatable on whether the council got the legislation 7 days before the vote, I don't even know if that's necessarily the same thing as being placed on the agenda. Thursday's meeting will make it 7 days before it's acted on next week. So by acted on next week, does that mean adopted? Because it seemed like the ordinance was simply, at the time it was introduced and on the agenda of the July 11th meeting, that which passed established the board. So is this a different ordinance? So confusing. There's part of me that's like, ugh, I don't want to go over this again. I already went over it. I feel like I'm just kind of repeating myself. Okay, so this planning board, this is more, I think this is definitely more extensive than the last one that I went over. So I suppose this is the amended language. So I guess that's where I'm confused, is there was proposed legislation at the July 11th meeting. And it's at the August 1st meeting that there is an amended proposed language of that legislation. So was the July 11th meeting where there was approval 4-3, what was that action? Was that an adoption? Was that a passing? Because I don't know that it's about the amendedness. Thursday's meeting will make it 7 days before it's acted on next week. But that's referring to the amendment, right? The amended language. The original, if you will, language of the July 11th proposed legislation that was acted on July 11th was not within 7 days. The city has also put out a call for new board members and has received 2 or 3 so far. Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent backwards to the code language and the ambiguities of not only the code language, but the ambiguities of the process, quite honestly. I understand what's being said about the 7 days. It is a little curious. But I still do find it interesting about conflict of interest. I'm curious, actually. Let's see if there's anything about conflict of interest. Officers and employees of the City of Troy shall not knowingly acquire, solicit, negotiate for, or accept any interest, employment, or other thing of value which would put them in violation of this code of ethics. Okay, I'm reading this article about a Supreme Court case that apparently had to do with a fraud statute, a federal fraud statute regarding state and local officials. The Supreme Court case came down and ruled that this state this federal fraud statute does not cover gratuities. And I was sitting here just reading this, not recording, and the article started getting into a really interesting expression, if you will, about, or highlighting about the worry that this particular rule will make it harder for federal prosecutors to use the statute as it was intended, theoretically, to keep local and state officials in check. And as soon as I read that, I recalled the question around conflict of interest. And so I just felt that this perhaps was an invitation to record some expression that may want to come through here. So let me screen recording. All right, so here's the article, ABA Journal. After Supreme Court limits prosecutors fighting corruption, what comes next? So the Supreme Court found a federal fraud statute regarding state and local officials does not cover gratuities, even if the payments were intended as rewards for official acts. The Supreme Court, quote, had a pretty reasonable interpretation of the statute, says Tokaji, who has taught classes on legislation and regulation. Quote, there are plenty of things to cry chicken little over, but this case isn't one of them. While alternatively, it may have far-reaching implications. Okay, so Snyder, this case, involves James Snyder, a former mayor of Portage, Indiana, who in 2021 was found guilty of violating a federal statute that prohibits state or local officials from accepting anything valued at more than $5,000 if it's intended to influence or reward them. According to federal prosecutors, after Portage awarded 2 contracts worth $1.1 million to a local trucking company, the company gave Snyder a $13,000 check. So ruling 6-3, the court found that statute does not cover gratuities. Justice Brett Kavanaugh found that the statute applied only to quid pro quo acts of bribery, behavior in which officials solicited, demanded, or accepted something of value before taking an official act, rather than accepting it after the act. Prosecutors argued that the statute was intended to cover gifts corruptly given to public officials as rewards for favored treatment. But Kavanaugh wrote that the agency's interpretation of the statute would create traps for unwary state and local officials. Okay, so this part was interesting. Is a $100 Dunkin' Donuts gift card for a trash collector wrongful? What about a $200 Nike gift card for a county commissioner who voted to fund blah, blah, blah? So this whole spiral into specific experiences, if you will, reminded me of similar arguments, if I remember correctly, similar arguments that were made by the dissent in the homelessness case. And it was a dissent written predominantly by, I believe, the sort of liberal progressive ideology. And here it's now by the more conservative ideology. So it's both sides behave very similarly, and it just appears they both do the same thing. There's just something about this that is very reminiscent, that sort of echoes the arguments that the dissent was making in the homelessness case, at least in terms of the specificity with which these the hypothetical specificity. And so the other interesting thing, this is where I stopped reading this article because I just was like, wow, this is really reminding me of the ethics consideration in terms of conflict of interest. Dissenting justices worry that the ruling would make it harder for federal prosecutors to use the statute as it was intended, to keep local and state officials in check, insinuating that there would be a conflict, there is a conflict of interest here, that there is a very, quote-unquote, sort of real potential of conflict where an official, employee or staff or just member of a political body or just a governing body, where that government sort of participant, if you will, where they are receiving some kind of thank you. Some kind of thank you. And I suppose the question is sort of, what is this thank you in relationship to? And if that thank you is in relationship to the official, the actor in their official capacity, that's where it starts to feel ambiguous. You know, to use these examples, could students take their college professor out to Chipotle for an end-of-term celebration? So in that sense, I mean, you could say that the students are expressing a thank you. There's some kind of ambiguity around the motivation of giving, the motivation of giving and receiving. And if that motivation to give and the motivation to receive is rooted in some quality or embedded with some quality of, how does this want to express? Because it's, yes, I could say corruption, but what am I really even saying in terms of corruption? What does that even mean? To say corrupt, something is corrupt. What is it that's corrupt, and what does it mean to be corrupt? And if so, would it somehow become criminal to take the professor out for a steak dinner? This kind of goes back to what I was talking about a couple videos ago, and if I can find this video, and if I can somehow link it, I still have to look into how to do that, but if I can link that video up here, I will. But this goes to what I was talking about in that video about criminality and what it is to even institutionalize criminality in a regulatory system, and how that has a relationship to common law and the sort of, although this framing wasn't in existence, if you will, at the time I was expressing it, to use what I've been sort of referring to in the latest videos about this numerical sense and sort of innate preference, there's a societal sort of collective innate preference that is activated, seemingly, from what I have understood, that activation, that emergence, is sort of the formulation, if you will, the manifestation, the concretization of that which is innately already experienced and already sort of wanted, if you will. What sort of society is moving toward, wanting, if I can use that terminology. And so this criminality is within that context as well, what is perceived and experienced as criminal and quote-unquote wrong or unworkable. And so this criminality is kind of what this innate preference, numerical sense, is kind of what I'm referring to in the quality aspect here. There's a feeling involved. There's a sense. There's a sense of unworkability, for lack of a better phrase. And it's interesting to me how with such... One of the other interesting things to me is I was thinking to myself, the other day, I was contemplating how it felt within the body. I noticed a shift in the body in relationship to overgeneralization. Overgeneralizations that I observed being expressed. And I was noting at the time to myself how it's very rare for me to personally feel offended. And for some reason, I noticed all of a sudden that a couple days ago, I read an article or someone's blog where the title, or one of the first things that was expressed, was how everyone is sheep. And there was something about reading that really felt like it hit a chord within myself. And so, not to necessarily, this isn't intended to go down that rabbit hole specifically, but just to recollect and notice how at that time, when I was experiencing that activation within myself, or in the context of what I perceived as an overgeneralization, these examples here, these hypothetical, and maybe they're not so hypothetical, maybe there are some experiences of these very natures, but the specificity of them is almost activates a similar feeling within myself of utter nonsense. And perhaps there is an aspect of the egoic sense of self that is taking it very personally. That's very possible. It's just that when I read this, not only did I notice how analogous it was to the arguments made by the dissent in the homelessness case, and how both sides do the same thing, but that it reflected back a sense of activation, emotional activation, of just nonsensical hypothesizing, which also sort of, brings me to another curiosity and wonder I was experiencing probably about a week or two ago in terms of conspiracy theorizing and ideation and ideas, and just sort of hypothesizing and theorizing, and the purpose and the meaning in that engagement. And perhaps where it sort of crosses a line, or something about it that was speaking to me in a way that I really was reflecting on just how that was being experienced within myself, because I engage in that so often. And I suppose it's these questions about how does that engagement inform the reality that I experience. And so I suppose I'm asking the same question about whether it's overgeneralizations or specificities, these narrations and potentialities that inform the infrastructure of our physical reality. And so, anyway. So how does this tie back to conflict of interest? And I suppose this is really the heart of that aspect of conflict of interest that I was referencing in regard to the Troy City Council amendments, or the amendment, and how, wait, let me see if I can remember it. Spain or Splain, I'm actually not recalling, but at least I got that far. But how council member, it's either Splain or Spain, McLaren, commented and inquired about conflict of interest, and this theoretically being the predominant conflict at play. Officials who use their public positions for private gain. It's also kind of interesting because it's like there almost has to be a conflict of interest. There has to be. It's like with that cell analogy from the last video, and there being that disturbance in the initial sort of emergence of the multiplied cell and cellular structure. There has to be that moment of conflict, if you will, the conflict being the disturbance, the experience of a state of being that is, I don't know if I'd necessarily say at odds with, but that is disturbing sort of the quote-unquote peace of the sort of state of being as it has been. And so the interest of the way of being as it has been, that sort of rather at peace state, the interest there in maintaining that structural integrity with the interest of this disturbance sort of emergence, this sort of disturbed activation in conflict, which is inherently sort of in conflict with that more peaceful structural integrity. So it's almost as though there has to be that experience of conflict in the process of emergence, which is not necessarily inherently to be labeled as bad and wrong. It's also not necessarily inherently good and right, if you will, to use those sort of words. It just is. It is. In a conceptual, experiential, perceptual sense. It is the present experience. And so there is this sense in this emergence, there is a sense of what is being called forth from within oneself, what the sort of direction is moving forward in time and space. And in that emergence, there is that which is greater than the sum of its parts. So it may not even per se be about, in a sort of absolutist sense, it may not in totality be about the conflict of interest. Perhaps there is an invitation to explore what those interests are, if that can even be expressed and known. And then there's this interest of change, of potentiality, of a new experience, and that new experience may or may not be a reiteration. What is the sort of correlative of a new phenotype within this sort of very political context? What is sort of like a synonym to the development of and the emergence of a new phenotype in this context? What is that? What would a new phenotype in official sort of relating be? So it's sort of acknowledging that there is conflict of interest, and that conflict doesn't even necessarily depend on there being some kind of personalization. It doesn't necessarily depend on there having to be some kind of personal benefit, if you will. That actually feels rather narrow in perception. Personalization almost feels like a privatization of this emergent phenotype, if you will. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. There is a sort of unique expression of that new phenotypic experience. It's the sort of egoic sense of self that personalizes it. That this makes it about me. So what if it's not about the specific official at question here? What if it's not only in quote-unquote sort of personalized experiences, personalized gifts, number one. And then it brings into question about gifts and receiving and giving and the sort of fundamental infrastructure on an energetic level of what it is to give and what it is to receive. And how those aspects of experience transcend beyond the egoic sense of oneself. That there is a landscape there of giving and receiving that goes beyond one's sense of themselves in a sort of personalized persona, where giving and receiving really are two sides of the same coin. To give is to receive, and to receive is to give. And there is a sense, there is an experience of giving and receiving that has a different quality in the experience. It feels different when that giving and receiving is from one's sense of I want to say integrity, It's that sort of, that flow over the cup, where one's sense of fulfillment in themselves fills up their own cup, where there isn't that sort of same dependence, if you will, on an external experience or external relationship for the filling of one's own cup. That is filled from within, and that which flows beyond the cup, that is given and given and received. I think I'm going to put a pause on this at the moment. There's a bunch of rabbit holes, a bunch of ships. I think I'm going to put a pause on this for the time being. The time being. Good morning. Let's see what we dig up today. It's warm in here, so let's see what the temperature calls for today. I think it's supposed to be warm today and tomorrow. Oh, well, it's come down a little bit. It was in the getting towards 90 either today or tomorrow, so it's cooling off. All right, so let's just see what we got. I know of the Higgs boson, but I'm not privy to much information about it specifically. It's interesting how there is this call for sites that are not haunted. Results show that a non-haunted control site had complex time-varying magnetic fields during long-term data collection periods at various days and times, similar to locations deemed to be anomalous. It's just interesting how there is this focus on maintaining scientific standards with controls, this perception of a control, as though it's mutually exclusive from that which is anomalous. To say that a control site, a non-haunted control site, makes such significant assumptions about reality. But what's also interesting is how electromagnetic fields, as far as I cognitively understand and to a degree understand within myself in a sensory way, the electromagnetic fields are fundamental to the perception and experience of this physical reality. And so to focus and to focus attention on those locations that are non-haunted assumes that only haunted sites are connected to electromagnetic anomalies. I don't know. It just kind of seems like a non-starter. I understand the desire for a control, the desire for a baseline sort of setting from which everything else is juxtaposed, contrasted, compared. And yet, who is to say that any control site is a baseline? Why is it not the inverse, where quote-unquote haunted sites are the baseline? Because in experience and in observation and in intuitive, just sensory awareness, hauntedness, if you will, is ubiquitous. Perhaps not ubiquitous. Maybe I shouldn't say ubiquitous. But it's what we associate with being haunted. What haunted means. Haunted tending to mean spirited, if you will, sort of beyond the physical body, spirited. Spirited in a manifestation beyond physical reality, and yet experienced within physical reality. So it perhaps is some transcendence of space and time, and that transcendence of space and time, sort of ironically, is more that multi-dimensional experience of being is ironically perhaps more of a control than a quote-unquote non-haunted site. It just seems like there's some kind of perhaps attunement within the frequencies, the frequencies of the body, for a lack of a better phrase. I actually wonder if there's some connection here to how emergence has been being expressed in the last couple videos, in the sense that what appears as anomalous also has a tendency of appearing random, or to a degree more random than predictable, except I suppose where certain sites are quote-unquote more active. And interestingly in that, I wonder if the sites that are more active are that they have that quality of experience, because to a degree, because the open the activation within oneself, I don't know how else to say, like the openness to receive frequencies that perhaps are not by default picked up within the body's sort of quote-unquote normal functioning, if you will. So when there is an openness to go beyond, and the openness can be intentioned and it on a conscious level, and it can also be intentioned subconsciously. And what I mean by that is there isn't necessarily a focus. So there's both an openness through intentional conscious acknowledgement, and then there's also openness through letting go, if you will, letting go of any focus and attention. So it's almost two sides kind of the same coin. But I just wonder if being in either, not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but to just be open to receiving electromagnetic disruptions in one's way of being, if you will. It's almost, I don't mean disruption with a negative connotation. I just mean it's a disruption in that it is kind of like I was, actually, it might not even have been the last video. It might have been a recording here. I don't know. Okay. But I don't know. I guess what wants to be acknowledged here, or perhaps what wants to be pointed toward, is that perhaps there is some sense, some innate sort of preferential numerical sense through the sort of activation. I don't know what I'm saying. There's like kind of two activation points going on. There's the activation within oneself to be open to reception of information via electromagnetism, frequency, to frequency in the form of electromagnetism, being open to reception of that form of information from beyond one's egoic sense of self. And so that, in that emergence of perhaps a more transcendent experience, there's that, if you will, and then there is also this bigger than oneself collective experience in a similar fashion, so that activation within oneself, the activation within the collective being, is also activation of perhaps more frequently received information, a more frequent cadence of receiving information. I don't know. I mean, I feel like that. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because not to say that it can only be that way, because I'm sure that there are plenty of times where it's just one person in a location where the activity is significantly more frequent than if there were 5 or 10 people there, especially because the collective, in a way, sort of perhaps needs to, kind of like with the illuminating bacteria, perhaps the collective and the individual, it doesn't really matter what scale, but there needs to be some kind of, with the bacteria, they were secreting hormones. As far as I recall, they were secreting hormones, and when that process reached a certain numerical value, if you will, that kind of activated the emergence of this quote-unquote sort of new phenotype, or just new experience in the collective illumination. It's almost, I don't know where I'm going with this. I mean, I could say a lot about it. I think it's interesting to think about. It's really interesting to think about because of what I've recently seen about like brainwaves, and the brainwaves, taking brainwaves and being able to recreate that image, that sensory experience. And off on a little bit of a tangent here. I feel like I just don't know enough about, like, electromagnetism. I mean, I guess if anything, I'm glad that they are a little bit more, quote-unquote, scientifically looking into this. Yeah, I just, this is very interesting to me, and to a degree, I wish I was a little bit more familiar with the electromagnetic aspect of things. Maybe I'll, like, come back to this, because I am very interested in it. I just kind of feel very, like, what appears as correct and useful for the individual, if you will, may not appear correct or useful in a collective perception yet. It all could be perceived as correct and useful, just as it could all be perceived as incorrect and not useful. It is both. I love that. For example, Thomas Edison said, "People say I have created things. I've never created anything. I get impressions from the universe at large and work them out. But I am only a plate on a record or a receiving apparatus, what you will." And express, receiving and giving, expressing. I love that though, impressions at large and work them out. In a way, impressions is reminding me also about the disturbance. I don't know if I would necessarily equate impressions with conflict in the way that I was talking about conflict of interest. Except that conflict of interest in the way that was being expressed is not necessarily the standard sort of experience and perception of what it is to be at conflict. And impression and impression, like a depression in a sort of homogeneous state, and then working outward, working from that point, expressing from that impression. An impression is abstract. It's experienced as abstract. Ideas are experienced sort of abstractly in the sense that they are experienced as that which is not yet concretized. It is not mere potentiality, if you will. It is beyond that. It has actualized to within some form. I suppose impression is more of an umbrella term under which can fall ideation. Hello? Hi. Very nice. How does it feel? I thought you were going to say, all I keep thinking is, I have to go to King's. Why? Because of the fog? Okay. Well, enjoy your time. Not particularly. Okay. Send me pictures. Love you too. Bye. This goes to what I was talking about, I believe, towards the end of my last video. Observation, observing the centered sense of alignment within oneself, observing that, not observing with as though you're looking at something and you're witnessing something, although it is that. It's observing in a sense of, for lack of a better phrase, sort of following the guidelines of, you're observing the guidelines, not necessarily per se as in simply witnessing as an observer. It is that in addition to an observance of, in a sense of adhering to. In a timeless dimension, succession may not exist the way that we think of it, in a linear fashion. This is still the question around observation. This is reminding me of the two sides of the same coin, two extremes, if you will, coming together, that conflict being a disturbance, impression, activation, from which a line is drawn. So that actually seems, in this physical reality, that seems to actually occur. That disturbance, that impression, from which the line is drawn, the demarcation, the bifurcation, the two sides of the same coin, the binary experience, simultaneous with a focal awareness, the focal awareness being the focal aspect of the whole, that sort of centered, disturbed. And by disturbed, it can be both impression in the sense that it's sort of a divot, and it can also be a focal point, an impression in the sense of a, what would I call that? Blip? Bump? A bump up? So the divot and the bump up forming some cylinder? Is that the word? Cylindrical form? Coagulation point? Coming together of your awareness of where you are and where you want to travel to. So that's feeling like somewhere akin to presence in potentiality. This is also a black hole. Sort of infinite density. I suppose I keep picturing this cell, and I have this tendency now to analogize abstract concepts and sort of coagulate them, if you will. Intend to cohesively interweave these narratives within the framework of cellular structure and cellular emergence in a way because it feels so fundamental in a physical sense and almost as evidence, if you will, of physical, of energetic, abstract, conceptual, theoretical, sensory knowingness, intuited awareness that underlies sort of births, not necessarily in a linear sense, but births that concretized, manifested physical observance of it, that unique expression, that observance, at that sort of fundamental level, if you will, taking that information and that perception and narrative and framework for perceiving quote-unquote sort of more mundane aspects of the human experience in how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to one another and institutions and the environment. And so looking at them through that lens, looking at these relationships through the lens of something that feels so fundamental, not only deconstructs those relationships, not necessarily with the intention that they be reconstructed anew, per se. It's that they are reformed. And that doesn't necessarily mean the baby is thrown out with the bathwater. So as much as this feels the analogy to cellular structures and abstract concepts, it feels intangible and inaccessible, and to a degree in correlation with the more mundane aspects of human experience, it can feel very irrelevant. It can feel very impractical. But it's sort of like looking at a forest of diverse, of a diverse ecosystem, and going to the depths of the roots of that ecosystem and how it operates, how it appears to operate, how it appears to relate within itself, how it appears to reflect the realities within the diversity of experiences. And through that observation, if you will, through that exploration, the landscape of the ecosystem is transformed. And it may appear as though that exploration won't even scratch the surface. And that's okay, and that's a valid perception. It's not the only perception, though. I also wonder if, so with this question, is there a universal constant that characterizes the mind-matter interaction? It seems like the diversity. So, however, none of their answers offered a useful specific number, and the wide range of answers did not suggest a clear path for further study. It's kind of interesting because this is reminding me of the numerical sense, and how I believe in that article it was talking, it mentioned something about the magnitude of that preference. So as the magnitude of that numeric preference increases, so too, well actually, okay, so let me backtrack for a second and invert what I was actually going to say. So as the magnitude of the numeric preference increases, so too does the spectrum of activation threshold. So for example, if the just for a simplistic example, if the numerical preference was 100, maybe the threshold spectrum that would need to be activated for that particular numerical preference would be somewhere between 80 and 120. Whereas if it's a smaller numerical preference, the spectrum relatively decreases as well, so that if the numeric preference is 3, then the spectrum is therefore going to be extremely narrow and narrowly tailored, so that even if it hits 2, it may not be activated. And even if it goes into I guess I'm not quite sure if it would go into 4, because it would probably surpass 3, but anyway, so it's interesting here because there's such a wide variety of answers to this particular question that it's almost as though there is not going to be, I guess, what am I trying to say? At first I was going to say, maybe because there is such a wide array of answers, maybe there's such a wide array of answers, but the question, almost in and of itself, is assuming a universality as a 1, as like the numeric preference sort of being 1. And because there's such a wide variety, I don't know. Anyway, I just kind of Something about that is interesting to me. Yeah, scattered. An expression of a single common life force. Thank you, B. Interesting. Dark matter. There were three main themes. One, a reconciliation of opposites. Interesting. I just got the imagery of, I've heard this example given before where someone has analogized time travel to taking a sheet of paper and drawing point A to point B on the sheet of paper, and then taking that sheet of paper and folding it so that point A meets point B, as though the sort of linear time travel is condensed into one sort of simultaneous moment. And it's sort of interesting to think about with the cell and the line being drawn, the expression, the expression from the disturbance, the impression, the emergent activation, or activated emergence, the immediacy, the simultaneity of that unified polarity, unified polarization, embedded within that, there being the experience of linear time and like distance, space and time, embedded within that, and yet it is simultaneously expressing as here, now, present, encompassing of all that potentiality. So simultaneously there is this expression of potentiality, and yet embedded within that the I suppose potential manifestation of travel, of movement in space and time, motion in space and time. Interesting. So I also, okay, it is the lack of the vibration of energetic presence. So this kind of reminds me of when the heart stops beating and you see on the monitor just that straight line. So that in a way is almost the lack of a vibration, the lack of an energetic presence, if you will. The lack of a vibratory nature, which still does have a vibratory nature. It's just a constant. That's a constant. Hilariously, because that goes to the other question they asked about constant, a universal constant. So it's kind of like that line that emerges, that polarized two sides of the same coin line that emerges and activates polarity, the emergence perhaps of polarity, the emergence of extremes, the emergence of opposites, that line that's drawn from the disturbance, from the emergence, activation, that centerness, that centered presence, what other words I've used, I don't even know at this point. But that line being the constant, being the constant note that in our culture has represented death. Perhaps one could say it represents the beginning and the end. It represents life and death. Because inherent in the perception of that monitor representing death, or the frequency on the monitor representing death, it simultaneously reflects life. So it's almost a reminder of polarized opposites, really. Anyway, I don't know what it's a reminder of. Yeah, dark matter is also devoid of that energetic vibration that is the presence of the life force. So interesting. But also one could say that in the constant of a one-note vibration, if you will, a one-chord note, is the constancy of frequency at all. Dark matter in the brain. Jump point. I don't know, I feel like I'm calling this specific point in the cell when that eruption happens, when that conflict happens, if you will. I've called it several things. And the intention is not to confuse it, it's just to, perhaps these are metaphors that I'm using, perhaps these are additional conceptual frameworks for what I'm intending to be the same thing, point towards the same thing, if you will. Jump point being another one of them. It's this jumping point, this activation, this numeric sense. It's initiation. And I know in a way it's like saying these things, it doesn't even mean anything. It tends to like not feel like it means anything, okay? So what? In a way, what just came to me is that this is just exemplified, this process is exemplified in human relationships. It's exemplified in the collective experience of itself. The human collective experience of itself. And so looking microcosmically and extrapolating that into the macrocosm, at least within the human experience, provides a whole different framework and a whole different perception on the experiences that are appearing to happen within the human experience, whether it's the human experience individually and or the human experience on a more broad scale. Very interesting. Jumping over to a somewhat seemingly unrelated topic, but I have a sense that perhaps not. this experiment and the apparent results remind me of the Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields. And how the morphogenetic fields, if you will, that perhaps emerged or that were emergent and or had emerged, for lack of a better phrase, around multicellular groupings and activation, those fields becoming, well, just, I don't recall exactly how it's phrased, but something like those field that the experiences within that field reinforcing itself over and over, so that the experiences become almost more prolific, almost like a default setting, than they are apparent one-offs. The cells that made it to the thickest outer layer displayed signs of collective behavior. The interesting thing about this graph is that it's showing the multicellular organisms appearing towards the end of the Sturtian glaciation. So, okay, sometime between. So I guess they just don't know when. By working together as a collective, the algae could preserve their mobility. Interesting. I almost wonder if the blueprint for multicellular formation emerged through the collaboration of unicellular organisms more so than an emergence from within the unicellular organism. So that the blueprint for multicellularity informed that morphogenetic field, so that sort of similarly situated, if you will, unicellular organisms who tuned into that sort of morphic genetic frequency, energetic frequency, was able to tap into that multicellularity in form, to activate that multicellularity in form. The multicellularity form already being in existence, if you will. However, the activation, the emergence of it into physical reality, perhaps even connected with the numerical sense, the numerical preference, if you will, of collaborating unicellular organisms. What that has to do with viscosity and density, I'm not 100% sure, although I'm not really 100% sure about any of this. At least on a conscious cognitive level. So it's almost as though the multicellular form emerged from within collaborative efforts, collaborative formation. So the multicellular formation, which is actually rather interesting because this is an example of how, I think it was the last video, how I sort of was inquiring into policy making, the quality of policy making from an externalized, imposed imposition, which feels a bit distinct from policy emerging from within, although they're not, in an absolutist sense, mutually exclusive. The experience of them feels of a different quality. And this is actually feeling like an example of that sort of externalized, imposed policy, if you will, preferential treatment, preferential activation and emergence that has that innate quality to it. So that the qualities of both experiences, both seemingly opposite experiences of innate preference being activated and setting policy coming from within, and yet simultaneously through external imposition. And so this kind of feels like an example where both feel satisfied and of a similar quality, of a similar nature, in a way that feels a little bit less controlling and micromanaged and strategized. Not to say that any of that is bad and wrong. There's just a different quality to the experience, and this is a very interesting example of that two sides of the same coin being experienced simultaneously of a similar quality sensorially. And I actually wonder if that kind of, similarity in quality, that there's like similarity in qualities again in like opposite ways. There's a similarity in quality where it feels very aligned in this. The reason I'm hesitating is because it's so easy to say that there is a similar quality where, anyway, I'm just wondering if this kind of example where so there's the experience where the imposition externally, the experience of an externalized, imposed policy, if you will, feels of a different quality than that which emerges from within oneself at a very deep level. Very deep level. I'm not talking about surface level. I'm not talking about in regard to specific issues here, but different in regard to that specific issue. This is innate preference that is, dare I say, constant. That is rather impenetrable by the diversity of experiences that appear to happen in one's life, if you will. And so there being that sense of policy, of integrity, and then juxtaposed with an experience of an externalized, imposed policy on a perhaps more collective level that conflicts with that appears to conflict with that is experienced in a quality of conflict, in a quality of discordance, incoherence, And there's that, and then there's this experience where it feels aligned, where it feels coherent, where it feels, and I guess maybe that's a question for myself, is have I ever actually even experienced that? I mean, maybe that's a question. I'm thinking to myself, have I ever actually had the experience where an innate sense of policy within myself emerging feels coherent with externalized, imposed policy preference, if you will? I don't know. But this feels like an example of that. Although I guess one could say that the viscosity and the cold temperatures that correlate with this experience of multicellular emergence, that perhaps that was at the time that was an inequality of conflict, that tension point, and it's only in this sort of egoic retrospective contemplation that there is a feeling of similarity and quality of the two sort of simultaneously being grounded in a sense of alignment. Okay, I remembered that I had another email referencing, I thought at the time that it was water, and it is water related, but it specifically is addressing ice, that form of water. And so I thought now sounded like a good time to find that and give it a little look-see. So here we go. All right. The Many Mysteries of Ice. If I remember correctly, salt water freezes at a temperature below what fresh water freezes at. Salt water freezes at a lower temperature than fresh water because of the salt. Fresh water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, while seawater freezes at around 28.4 degrees Fahrenheit. So not a tremendous difference in temperature. The more salt in the water, the lower the freezing point. I mean, that's kind of an interesting question too, in terms of the multicellular emergence, theoretically anyway, in the sea. Millions of years ago, what was the ratio of water to salt at that time, amongst other variables? So it's just kind of interesting to think about the viscosity as well as the minerals that were present in the water. There's also, when I remembered that I had another article related to water in my email, I thought at the time that the article was more focused on the intelligence of water. And that's another aspect that comes into play in terms of the multicellular emergence. Is the viscosity, the minerals perhaps, the temperature, but the intelligence of the water as well, and the information within the memory of the water. And perhaps it's not even necessarily only organisms perceived as alive that formed this sort of morphogenetic field that holds space, if you will, or formulates multicellular activation structures and formations that contain the potentiality of that emergence. Ideate that emergence. It's also interesting to think of the body being, what, 80% water? Yeah, the human body is made up of 50 to 75% water. Yeah, the brain, 95% water. It's like the brain is its own ocean. If the brain were analogized like the ocean, I don't know, is there sodium in the brain? If the brain were analogized as the ocean and there's this multicellular emergence, the hexagonal grid of H2O molecules forms naturally on ponds and in the sky, but under more extreme conditions, the same molecules can assume other arrangements. Blasting apart water droplets with high-intensity lasers. Black, hot, and metallic. Neptune and Uranus. Interesting. It's like dark water. Oh! Oh my gosh! Bless you, Otis. Bless you. What a silly boy. The counterintuitive phenomenon drove physics to consider in the abstract how a system in a state of change, such as warm water in a freezer, reaches an unchanging equilibrium, such as ice. Counterintuitive. Okay. All right. Well, currently we're doing the pause. Okay, so this morning I woke up and when I went onto YouTube, I saw a newer posting by this gentleman, Anton I might be mispronouncing his last name, Petrov. I've followed him for some time. I don't regularly watch his videos, but this one in particular caught my attention because it specifically was addressing complex life, and that seemed to sort of piggyback off of the article about the ocean's the ocean viscosity millions of years ago during, what were they framing it as? Ice Earth, or Ice Age Earth? Anyway, so I saw this video thumbnail, and so I gravitated towards watching it today and seeing what he has to report on, or what information he's sharing in regards to this complex life sort of formation, if you will. Okay, so let's see what happens when I do it this way. Oh, you know what, actually? Okay, so let's... shit. So I'm gonna make it a little less and hope to God. Okay, then I'm gonna make this... I don't know what this is gonna do, but we'll see. Here we go.
So in this video, I wanted to once again discuss a somewhat unusual proposition that was made approximately 10 years ago in regards to the origin of more complex life on planet Earth compared to some of the more modern propositions, and specifically a potential existence of relatively complex multicellular life as far back as 2.1 billion years ago, or roughly around 1.5 billion years before we actually think complex life appeared. But I guess more importantly, would actually suggest that at some point in the past, multicellular complex life actually failed. All of this started back in 2008, and specifically by a professor, Al Albani, whose team discovered these unusual three-dimensional shapes in many different locations in the West African country of Gabon. And strangely enough, many of them were sort of three-dimensional, resembled very bizarre ear-like shapes, and many of them were actually kind of large. Earliest fossils from approximately 2.1 billion years ago. Now, as we've discussed in some of the previous videos about animal life, this is way older than anything we know of. But in essence, we think that most of the multicellular life very likely kicked off approximately 600 to 700 million years ago, possibly following the last glaciation period, and following a lot of unusual experimentation with different sizes and shapes, where a lot of different jellyfish-like creatures and a lot of different shrimp-like creatures started to appear everywhere. And though there have been signs of potential other animal life from even before that, a lot of this evidence so far is kind of sparse. But these unusual radial structures, all of which were inside 2.1 billion year old rocks, eventually made it into his publication, but were not particularly known and were obviously disputed by a lot of scientists. But then in 2014, I guess somewhat by accident, all of this went viral when the Natural History Museum of Vienna basically named this Gabonionta, an experiment of life and a new type of life that nobody ever knew existed, literally making this go viral overnight. And obviously after this, a lot of scientists started to try to disprove this, providing a lot of counter-evidence. And though Al Albani, the original professor, continued his research and still suggested that this was maybe life, his actual wording was really not that strong. He was definitely open to interpretations. But for the next few years, more and more studies started to come out, essentially providing a lot of counter-evidence that this was just a geological formation, and was essentially a kind of a pseudo-fossil. And so even though here biological origins were questioned by many studies, Al Albani was actually discovering additional evidence too. For example, he even found evidence of something possibly moving through the sediment around the same time. And these signs of mobility are obviously kind of difficult to explain. Once again, these were large structures. These were structures inside this ancient rock, and they were showing something that's not microscopic moving through the ancient sediment. And many of these even appeared as unusual strings of pearls that would be kind of difficult to explain if this was a purely geological formation. Many of these also showed three-dimensional growth, and actually coordinated growth as if something was growing on purpose, with further additional studies even discovering more features, including those unusual disks, that seem to have unusual concentrations of certain elements, such as zinc, compared to the surrounding sediment. And so if these were biological, they could have been actually breathing oxygen. Well, surprisingly, a lot of more recent evidence, especially chemical evidence, started to point at these being strange collections of different cells, possibly similar to a typical microbial mat. And more importantly, these unusual formations seem to have disappeared in the overlying black shale, suggesting a potential extinction, with the implication being that these creatures appeared during the Great Oxygenation event approximately 2.1 billion years ago, and then disappeared when the oxygen levels dropped during the Logamunti excursion event. But the real reason we're discussing this today is because of the most recent study, released in August of 2024. And this here provides us with a potential explanation for why this even existed. Here this explains the geology of this bizarre region and basically suggests that this involved some kind of a continental collision, producing a lot of underwater volcanoes, which suddenly formed an extremely rich in nutrients laboratory for a lot of these organisms to suddenly evolve. For example, today we know that phosphorus is crucial for evolution, especially for the transition from the single cell to multi-cell organisms. We know that marine phosphorus is correlated with seawater oxygen concentrations and also with the biological evolution around 635 million years ago.
Does oxygen level increase or decrease with viscosity? Water's viscosity and oxygen content are related to temperature. Water with lower temperatures has higher dissolved oxygen concentrations. What is dissolved oxygen? When water contains all the dissolved oxygen it can at a given temperature, it's 100% saturated with oxygen. Super saturated. I don't know.
Sudden increase in oxygen, a huge jump in phosphorus, and basically extremely similar conditions to those 630 million years ago when we know complex life started to definitely appear. And the implication here is that this was some kind of a very unusual localized environment that produced a kind of a biological bubble where for a few hundred million years the conditions led to high oxygenation, a huge production of a lot of different nutrients, and literally a kind of a first biological laboratory for life to try to evolve into something else. Because here what this kind of implies is that Earth might have had a kind of a two-step evolution of complex life. It seems to have tried to evolve something 2.1 billion years ago, but that something failed, with all this multicellular life very likely disappearing and only single cells surviving. But because this first step,
I don't know if I'd qualify it as failed, especially if there was some kind of climate change that perhaps resulted in that environment that was sort of just right for producing life or producing multicellular organisms, if the environmental conditions shifted. So I don't know that I'd necessarily say it failed. It perhaps just wasn't the quote-unquote right time. But the emergence, that morphogenetic field of structure, of energetic.
and obviously why exactly it succeeded 600 million years ago and not 2.1 billion years ago is currently unclear. But if complexity of life arises every time there's a jump in oxygen and a sudden introduction of nutrients, this would definitely have huge implications in the search for extraterrestrial life. But, at least for now, we still have to take this with a grain of salt. Despite multiple signs and despite multiple pieces of evidence, this can still be interpreted in other ways. For example, as I mentioned, some of those fossils do resemble inorganic fossils discovered elsewhere, and some of these chemical signatures can actually be completely irrelevant. And so it will
I also think it's interesting to qualify it as a failure when I think he even said in here, it's unclear or perhaps unknown at this moment what the cause was for any perceived disruption between this this initial emergence and an emergence 600 to 700 million years ago. So if it's unclear what that disruption was, and it's not clear if there were any quote-unquote survivors of this disruption, it's sort of like having a giant blank spot unless I'm misunderstanding, and perhaps there is some evidence, if you will, information regarding that stretch of time between, what is this, 2 billion years ago and 600 to 700 million years ago, if in that gap there has been absolutely no evidence and information regarding any complex life. But even that doesn't say 100% with absolute certainty that it wasn't existing. That the blueprint, that the energetic framework, if you will, and morphogenetic field wasn't already existing, wasn't already realized. So perhaps this is a bit nitpicky, but just qualifying it as a failure and actually lumping them into two separate categories of this is the initial emergence and perhaps this is a secondary emergence, it may just be a process of emergence that is not so black and white, discernibly mutually exclusive, even to the planet.
Probably take at least a few more years to basically determine what this is all about. And so until future studies, we're just basically going to leave it at that.
The yin-yang. It also kind of looks like two sides of a same coin. The two sides sort of coming together, the drawing a line. In a way, kind of the picture of, it's almost like a snapshot of the cell, the unicellular body in that moment of separation, if you will. I love that. Following the collision of two continents. Two sides of the same coin coming together. Which created a nutrient-rich laboratory for the earliest experiments in complex biological evolution. I think I asked something like if there was a moment before activation where there is a sense of something coming. Perhaps I was questioning that in the context of a tension point. Questioning where a tension point might fit in. That conflict, the disturbance. I mean, when I think of nutrient enrichment, the first thing that comes to mind is, what is that called? Estuary? An estuary? Where the sediment is all churned together, merging, very nutrient rich as far as I recall. Perhaps energetically on an energetic level, on an energetic infrastructural level prior, if you will, to the physical emergence, the physical manifestation, the physical appearance. Perhaps there's some kind of numerical sense informing behavior, if you will, informing the structures of being. There's some kind of numerical sense of environmental cues, if you will, environmental conditions such as the richness of nutrients, the diversity of nutrients, the concentration of nutrients, the concentration of certain chemical attributes like oxygen, phosphorus. And the flip side of that, the sort of quote-unquote lack thereof of other chemicals and conditions that perhaps would prevent that kind of emergence. I love this suturing. This reminds me actually of a poem I wrote a couple years ago at this point. Maybe I'll put it in here. Humankind experiences physical reality through contrast of concepts, a linear duality. We have to know darkness to know the light, as we have to know day to know the night. But all that we are is process in motion, cyclical in nature, absolute in devotion. Attachment to distinct parts prolongs separation, when in truth all are one. Division is reparation. Accepting that all flows as transitions of being is a practice I have found to be most freeing. The past contrasts the future unless a state of wholeness grabs a suture. Infusing layers of been and will be is us of the present, all together seamlessly. I just keep thinking back to how this process is unfolding macroscopically in the experience of the human species right now, currently. I mean, it's been unfolding. It's not as though it's just this moment only. As an example, or as a mirroring. But it's just this process continuing to emerge in more complex formations. It's also interesting too because that form that was shown in that video, that sort of elongated form that was kind of constructed of what looked like a bunch of bulbs. First, it reminded me of the intestines. But as I'm sitting here, it's also reminding me of I forget what the phrasing is for it, like the sort of medical term, if you will, but just the gland that is the brain. So if that was all sort of squished together, it would kind of look like a brain. Yeah, failed. Interesting to say the least. Very interesting. I'm a little bit interested in oxygen and the sort of analogy of oxygen to that which is facilitating a rise in complexity within human socialization. That's interesting. I will, however, be putting a pin in that for now.